Now we're going to be talking about the neuron. Neuron is the basic functional cell of the nervous system. It's actually the cell that generates and sends and conveys the signals, the information between the cells. And it's supported by the glial cells. However, those only play a supportive role. They don't really convey the information. Neurons are very special kind of cell. Not only they generate all of our consciousness, movements, etc. Also, functionally, they're very, let's say, differentiated. They specialize in one thing, that's the carrying of the signal, and they can't do much else properly. Also, in this, because of this, they have very special structure. It's something that you need to learn a little bit about. So this would be the actual body of the neuron, obviously with your nucleus here in the middle. Now the cell body, the main part of the cell, is sometimes also called soma. Sometimes instead of soma, in other books, you can see the term neurocyte. Oddly enough, neurocyte is not equivalent to neuron, but neurocyte is equivalent to the term soma. See, because neuron is not only the cell body, but also with the processes that come out of the soma. And so there's really two types of processes that leave the neuron. One is the thin and abundant processes. They're called dendrites. Okay, and what's the function of dendrites? Dendrites really take the information from the surroundings and they carry it towards the neuron's soma. See, so the neurons, they might be connected, let's say, to other neurons, and if they are sort of next in the line of carrying information, dendrites would be the accepting part, the accepting processes. Thing is, neurons can carry information only in one direction, and the direction is from dendrite to soma to axon. And so dendrites carry the information centripetally. That's our dendrites. Then the other part of the neuron is the axon. Axon is the long and thick process. There's only one, which is in contrast to dendrites, where you can have many dozens, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of dendrites. But pretty much always you have one axon. There are some exceptions, but good rule of thumb, only one axon for each neuron. Okay, and while you do only have just one axon, at the end, the axon splits. And let's say the splitting of neuron is somewhat reminiscent of the roots of a tree. And this is why people call it the terminal arborization. Okay, and at the end of each of these small, teeny tiny branches of the axon, you have a widening. This is sometimes called the synaptic button or terminal button, or sometimes you can see the French version, which would be like bouton terminal. However, I think the term terminal button is sufficient for us. And so the function of axon is to carry the information centrifugally with respect of the soma. Okay. Sometimes on axon, this is not always the case, but often you have a special structure wrapping around the axon. These would be the myelin sheaths. Okay. And no coincidence, I labeled it in different color because myelin sheaths actually are different cells to neurons. They are not extracellular structure, but they are actually intracellular structure. If you are looking in the peripheral nervous system, then every single myelin sheath, So in this case, we have 4 of them. Every single myelin sheath would correspond to one cell. And this cell is called the Schwann cell, right? So let's say this is the case. And so every single myelin sheath would be made up by one Schwann cell, right? This is, however, only in the peripheral nervous system. In the central nervous system, in the brain or spinal cord, the myelin sheaths would be made up by glial cells called oligodendrocytes. And usually one oligodendrocyte creates dozens and dozens of myelin sheaths. And actually one oligodendrocyte can myelinate many axons. And so this is, let's say, kind of important distinction for your exam, to know that myelin sheaths are not only composed of Schwann cells, but also oligodendrocytes. Okay, and there's one more place of the neuron that I would like to point out, and that's the axonal hillock. Be located somewhere here. Axonal hillock is the funnel-shaped part of the axon, and this is actually the place where all the signals come in from the dendrites and soma are, let's say, integrated, and when there is decided if the cell will be active or not. So the neurons only function in, let's say, binary code, in that they either send the information along the axon or they do not. Right? It's not like they can fire a little bit or a lot. They only fire and do not fire. And this has to be decided somewhere, right? Because if the cell is connected to thousands and thousands of other cells, which actually is possible, and every cell sending some different signals, some part of the cell has to be responsible for, let's say, interpreting those signals, putting them together, and then deciding. The place where the deciding takes place is the axonal hillock. How exactly that works, we're going to talk about later, but you should be aware of where it is located, and we're going to talk about function a little bit more. Okay. Now, just for a review, how would such a neuron function? Okay, so let's say this neuron is on some motor pathway, right? So there would be some neuron that would tell this neuron to fire, right? So let's say here would be somewhere in the distance, there will be some other neuron, and this neuron would send an axon, right? Then of course you have your terminal arborization, but we are interested in the axon that actually synapses on this dendrite. Okay, so here the signal is carried from the axon onto the dendrite, and then it moves centripetally into the axonal soma. Okay, here the signal spreads through the cell through something called saltatory conduction, which is something we're going to talk about. And if it's strong enough, it will reach all the way to axonal hillock, and it will persuade the axonal hillock to fire. Okay. If it's strong enough to persuade the axonal hillock, then action potential will fire, and then the signal will be carried all the way through the axon, through the terminal arborizations, and into the terminal button, right? And here you might have another structure waiting. Let's say in this case it would be skeletal myofiber. Right? And so this is how the contraction might occur. Every single of these terminal buttons, if this would be a motor neuron, every single of these terminal buttons would be connected to their own myofiber, and they will be able to fire the cell and make the myofiber contract. Okay. And now, if the signals from this neuron would be too weak, then to not persuade the axon hillock, the cell would not contract the myofiber at the end. Usually, the neurons take information from dozens or maybe hundreds of other neurons, and then they decide, is this impulse strong enough for me to do something or not. Sometimes it might happen that this neuron here, that it would actually fire and nothing would happen. It's absolutely possible, especially if there would be some other neuron which would, especially if there would be some other neuron which would try to persuade our neuron here not to fire, to stay chill. Okay. So this is it, the basic structure of neuron. And next we're going to be talking about the function of the neuron.